Good morning, committee.
Morning.
Feels a long time since we've been here together. I guess it has been. So wanted to start the day with a committee conversation about sort of where we're going and how we're trying to do it. On a few different fronts. One, I want to sort of talk about the buckets of the work that I see in front of us. And then also figure out a strategy for, we're all doing a lot of reading, or at least you're all receiving a lot of potential reading to do and being provided with time to do that reading. So I'm just going to assume everyone's doing a lot of reading. And I know it's very hard to focus on things in this building sometimes. So, and thought it might be useful to like fit in some sort of discussions on each reading in a structured way, which is not how we usually do our work in this building. And so also just wanted to talk that idea through with people and hear your thoughts. So before that, so buckets, which is not a very nuanced way to describe it, but that's what I have for you. So the Education Committee is doing its work to look at the significant policy proposals that are right now just a rough outline from the administration. Language is coming soon. It is not here yet, and the details really matter, and those details are very unclear right now. Any education finance system, as we heard even from APA last week, the consultants from AOE, a finance system only works when it's developed with the assumptions of the policy that it's based on. And so we, in doing our work, need to be careful that we're not getting too far ahead of the Education Committee, because then our work won't be relevant and well synced. So that's one part of how we're taking on our work this year. So that's sort of, I'm going to put that in the bucket of how the money gets from the education fund to the districts, right? That's whether that's a foundation formula or something else, that sort of how the money gets from the education fund to the districts. There's a separate bucket of our work that's a little clearer right now, and that's how the money gets from people's bank accounts, businesses' bank accounts to the education fund, right? And that's our underlying property tax structure and otherwise. And we have property tax credit proposals in front of us, both from the administration, Public Assets Institute has put forward a brief, the Chamber of Commerce, the Lake Champlain Chamber of Commerce has worked with a stakeholder group this summer. They have proposals. So there's the property tax changes to the property tax system, and especially how tax credits work within that and income adjustments. That's another bucket of work. That to me feels like some of the more straightforward work in front of us, and it's not going to be easy. It's just slightly more straightforward, and I feel like we have more tools at our disposal to do that. Within that same area, there is, within our property tax system, how do we even know what our property tax base is, right? And that's the work from the administration about how appraisals work, how the CLA works, how the grand list works, that whole sphere of work. And so there's sort of those two pieces within how money gets into the education fund, property taxes, the grand lists. And then there's also like a study that's come back to us on tax sales. So that little piece, huge piece. And then foundation formula or otherwise, how that gets out to districts. In all of that work, there are significant best practices available for us from all around the country. Some of them might be similar to how Vermont already organizes itself, and some of it might not be. And that's why I keep on sending articles to everyone, because we are in a really interesting situation, I think, and the legislature is always in the situation, right? Like a lot of us are new to the Ways and Means Committee, though, or new to the legislature, or both. And we have just like an enormous amount of catch up all to do in order to do good work this biennium. And that's fine. And I think we're all very capable of doing that. And I think we have an incredibly smart, capable committee with really like broad expertise and a pretty diverse districts. And that feels really exciting. And so just sent you articles from the Lincoln Land Institute. They're like a really strong touchstone on best practices for property taxes, and our joint fiscal office works with them really regularly. I mean, looks to their work very regularly. I know the tax department looked to their work a lot in how they did the property tax proposals they worked on. And so really encourage people. I've gotten very lost in their website a number of times. Really encourage people to like read everything possible from them, and want to have sent around a webinar about that yesterday. Want to have a committee discussion about that. They are not available to testify in committee. That's just not how they do their work. They really like to stay a little separate from the legislative process. And so want to really just like would love feedback from folks on like how we can best process the information that we're learning about and hearing from people. And then on the how does money get from the education fund to districts, tomorrow we're going to hear testimony on essentially best practices for education finance systems and best practices for foundation formulas from some of the leaders in this work nationally who have done this work with lots of other states. And so I'm hoping that from that, we can really piece together for ourselves what key principles we want to make sure that we're mindful as we continue our work. Because we're going to be sifting through a lot of numbers, a lot of ideas, and I think we're going to need touchstones in order to make sure that we're not missing pieces and that we're making decisions carefully and mindfully rather than just sort of comparing or vibes. So I think I'm going to stop my monologue there. And yes, Representative Brannigan.
So I do have a number of pieces from the Lincoln Institute, but I can't find anything about a tax sale.
Mhm.
Has Social mailed that to us yet?
There was a report from last year when we put together that tax sale bill and passed it. We set up a little working group. Sorry to use the diminutive. We set up a working group to explore certain pieces of that bill. And I think they've given a report to us.
That's where the.
Yes, and so
Is that the language? Is that the working group that just,
I think Chris Delia was on it.
It was.
I sent it to Charlie and we'll make sure.
Okay, great, okay.
Okay.
So we'll send that around. That's one piece of it. And that's also, I think, on our reports tab, or should be on our reports tab
It's on the reports.
Yeah.
Okay.
of the website.
Thank you.
But I'm just curious if people have like ideas or preferences so that we're not just like all combing through a library on our own, but have space to sort of process what we're learning and thinking about as we read. That feels useful. Yeah, Jim.
I'd start by saying this conversation where you're starting this morning, Madam Chair, is eminently useful.
Okay.
And I've been wondering, and you're basically addressing my needs as to what we're doing here, which is a sarcastic way of saying how we're going to proceed through this sort of stuff, and I appreciate it very much. And I'd also say I agree with you completely. We have a very competent committee. Everybody here's an asset. So even if you're brand new, very much an asset, and I appreciate it. And we'll see where we go. And so just as for the governor's proposal, he's thrown a whole lot out there. And I, for one, haven't the foggiest idea how the governor proposes to knit it all together into something that we can actually work with and our constituents can use, as opposed to just throwing out a bunch of ideas out there that will resonate with some people. So I'll shut up now.
Okay. We'll figure that, we're gonna figure that part out. That's our work. Also just want to add, I think, I was sort of hoping we were not going to need to dive too deeply into the personal income tax space this year, just because we have enough to do. And in the budget address yesterday, we heard what I think are some great proposals from the governor about expanding the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit.
Right.
And so in order to do that work and explore that work, we will need to dive deeper into the income tax base. So that's also on our, in case anyone felt like our menu was not far-reaching enough, we also are going to need to do that. And we'll hear more about that at 11 from Commissioner Gresham and Bolio.
Downtown tax credit too.
And then, yes, yeah, that one's usually, for some reason, we're able to get through quickly. I don't, like, maybe it's just because we say yes usually. So thoughts from people on like how, if those buckets make sense to you, and then especially would just really love like advice on how to be incorporating our reading and learning as we do our, like, as we're doing our work. Do committee discussions about specific readings seem weird or feel good, or I don't know. Yeah, and people, I don't need to do hands, we're just, this is like,
Oh, Madam Chair, just, whether it's a 195-page report or whatever, I don't have the time.
Yeah.
And so I particularly choose the sections that I hope would be most beneficial, of course, especially the conclusions.
Mhm.
I mean, even in the Lincoln report here, I started to look at it yesterday. And I didn't dig into it deep enough, but it looks to me like, again, they really aren't covering, as far as property taxes go, my rural constituency. They talk about, water and sewer treatment plants, and, we don't have any, well, I shouldn't say that. We do in Troy and JP. But anyway, yeah, it's just a lot to digest, and all I can say is I'll do my best, but there's a lot out there.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that I share a confusion on how to compartmentalize everything we're talking about. And I finally went to a system of using OneDrive and putting our various reports in those various, making up my own categories so that I can look at things in one way. And that's a help to me, but you're absolutely right. It is such a broad thing, and I'm struggling with figuring out how to look at things in groups and figure out how they relate together, and then how they relate to the whole big picture.
Yeah.
And we do need to understand what the educational philosophy is going to be, or the policy changes,
Yes.
because that's certainly going to affect how we want to do the finance. I'd appreciate it. So I just share that confusion with everybody.
so, and I want to be sort of like clear again about the sort of two and a half categories I see. There's how money gets into the education fund, which is sort of the tax system. And I would divide that between sort of the base and appraisals and grand list. And then how people pay. And that includes like property tax credits and things like that. And so that's sort of the A and B of one. And then two is how resources get to districts. And that is, I think, the question of to do a foundation formula or not to do a foundation formula. And if to do a foundation formula, how to structure such a thing. Yeah.
More straightforward.
So one thing that I think other, I feel like other committees occasionally do, did Commerce do like book reports on reports? Was that a thing?
Some people volunteer to read reports and then give a committee a presentation as to what was contained in the report. Just the highlights.
I've heard you did that.
Yeah. So it could be just an executive summary, read the executive summary and share people with what the data source is and all that kind of stuff. That seemed to work because there was a lot of information for everyone to try to go through.
I think you mostly did that, didn't you, Charlie, in committee?
I volunteered on that occasion. Yeah.
Well, that's settled then.
I think it's important that we all, if that's how it works, that we all hear it at the same time. That if we've read it and we have things that we didn't think were the same, or the things to add, that we all think about that at the same time. Or we'll be having crossed conversations and not connecting. We may disagree, but we should connect on what we read.
Yeah.
And I also think that what the purposes or the would you say? What are the key principles to keep in mind, you said? I think that's kind of the center of it all. What we're trying to achieve. in the middle. And then everything, we have to talk about everything in terms of that. And that might change or whatever over time, but we have to know what we're driving for, vision and mission.
Yeah, to that end, Madam Chair, I was thinking about just why a lot of us ran for office. And is there a way to provide property tax relief to a lot of the people that we've spoken to? That's property tax credits, but to even put it in that bucket,
Mhm.
what are all the things that we could do within that? The spaghetti against the wall type of thing,
Mhm.
that's within our purview. Right, that's reasonable for us to investigate each one of those underneath that kind of
Mhm.
umbrella.
Because of the nature of legislative scheduling and the sort of flow of information from the administration, it's in some dream universe, we would do each of those three buckets consecutively rather than concurrently. Such is not the nature of work in this building. And so I'm going to do my best to be really articulate when we have committee time scheduled to name which of those three buckets we're in, or if we're outside of those three buckets. And really would appreciate if folks, as we're taking testimony on those areas, to either bring in the readings or ask to set aside time to discuss a reading in that context, and to start naming. I think the guiding principles are helpful. I also think naming the tensions is helpful, right? So if we look at, questions about the grand list and about appraisals, there's a real question of, we have a statewide education fund, having each district decide things on their own. Each town decide things on their own. There's like fairness questions there and accuracy questions there, right? But we also have, a very strong tradition of local control and a system that a lot of folks feel like is working right now. So how do we balance those two things, right? And just naming those tensions and making them so that we're not all just sitting with them in our own heads, I think might be helpful as well as we're doing this work, so that we're really being clear on what we're prioritizing. Yeah.
I appreciate that. I also appreciate the way you started this conversation, because we're talking about a system here, and this system is plagued with unintended consequences. And it's also plagued with contradictions. And one of them is the one that you just mentioned, the tension between state oversight and support and local control. There's also tension between consolidation and choice. There's tension between affordability and, I'm looking for the savings, because what I heard is affordability, and every single thing I heard yesterday is actually going to increase ed spending. So I'm trying to figure out where the savings are. And I feel like if I have at the end of the session to be able to say to my voters, I looked for ways to help bring down the cost so that you can live your life. And I need to see that somehow in a proposal, and I'm not seeing that yet.
I also just want to name, because it seems irresponsible not to, that like there's a real possibility that all of our work will be completely upended because the Federal Agency of Education is going to withdraw all funding from the state. So like, I know it feels wild to say, but like, I think that's a real possibility on the table. And I don't think we should pretend it's not a possibility, right?
Yeah, I think that's such an important point to make, not because we don't know that, because I think we're all like waiting for the shoe to drop, but the weights are an effort to treat poverty. And we have made a decision in this state to treat poverty through our school system. That has significant implications for affordability and for coherence of service provision. The EICT is an effort to treat poverty at that household level. That is going to interact with the weights as well. So we can't talk about these things separately of each other, because these are philosophical choices about where we think we make people and communities strong. And I get worried when we start talking about this one-offs without thinking of the cumulative effect, if that makes sense.
Yes, and I think the more we talk about how everything's all mixed up with each other, the more impossible it becomes to find a way through the thicket. right?
Totally.
And so hoping that at least these buckets and some core sort of principles and tensions can help us find our way through the thicket. Because none of these decisions are gonna, can be transactional. There's not gonna be a clear answer about any of them. And I don't think most of them will be partisan either.
I wonder if at least at some point soon, well, maybe not, soon, we could look at where federal monies are going to see if we just have clear idea of that picture so that we know what we might have to deal with if they go away.
So that is in the Agency of Education has a budget book, I think is that what it's called? And that's all in there. Starting on page 18. But we can take some testimony on it. Yeah, you can borrow this.
So just figuring how we're gonna make this up somehow.
I don't even know if there is a universe where we can, so that's an
No,
interesting question.
Don't, but
Yeah.
what do we do if?
But do we have authority or do we have guts to just plug in some of those holes in this proposal? You know, the governor gave a pretty, I mean, it's a good structure. I like the plan, but there are many places where he didn't give us the information. Like what's the base figure for each student, for example, minor, but sarcastic there. Is that our job now to fill in those holes?
I don't think it's our job yet. I would like to, the administration has the whole of the administration to do work, right? And
Yeah.
experts to do that work. And so I believe we're getting numbers later this week and getting legislative language in an ongoing way. And so I'm hopeful that we can work from what they're proposing in a detailed way and then do our due diligence to say, is this detail the detail that works? Does it work with these other details? Does this work with the law? We have full authority we're a separate branch. We have full authority to set this and we must. And if time goes by much longer, we might need to start plugging in our own stuff. I would say, likely the numbers that we get from APA are going to be different than the numbers we get from PICUS and different from the numbers we might get from Professor Colby. And that's how this works, right? We heard testimony that in Colorado, they had two parallel sets of modeling with two, and so we'll hear testimony about how that worked out. But
So
I don't need to call on anyone, we're just talking.
as we go along and when looking at the foundation grants,
Mhm.
we have to keep in mind that it needs to be Brigham compliant.
Mhm.
We shouldn't forget that.
No, absolutely not. And Thursday, right? 5:00, House Chamber, really great panel discussion on Brigham. I think it'll be fun if you're a legislative nerd and you all are.
So one thing I'm thinking about and that I'm worried about, and I'm sure you know the calendar much better than I do. But always concerned about timing. And if we can't get through a good chunk of our work this year, we'll hear another proposal next year for another $70 million to cover the general fund. And I think that one thing I heard from my constituents is going back to Representative Holcomb's point about affordability. And conversely, what we heard from the governor and what we've seen so far, I agree, is probably going to increase education spending. And if that's true, or even if we flatlined and spent the same amount of money for the next 5 years on education, people still think and feel that their property taxes are too high. And so I'm thinking about, it's never made sense to me why we have one non-homestead rate. Rhode Island has 11 different types of non-homestead rates and further tax classification and things like that. So I want to make sure that we are looking systems wide at our entire tax structure and that we're doing everything we can to diversify the amount of money that's coming into the education fund so that it's not just, I know it's not just residential property taxes, but that's where people are feeling it. And I think that there's a lot of things that we could do within the existing tax structure to sort of right size who is paying what for our schools. And I think that fits a little bit into the buckets that we talked about here, but I'm just concerned that about time and about just repeating ourselves over and over in this death spiral.
So I know from watching the Commission on Future Public Education that you had this spreadsheet for, sort of brainstorms about how to, I think there was a bigger brainstorm that was sort of all different ideas about education, but you specifically for ed finance had one. And I wonder if there's some system like that where we could each dig deeply on one of these, even if it's a set of reports, one person sort of becomes an expert on this particular report and the ones related to it. And as you said, sort of does a little book report and facilitates a bit of discussion about that specific thing. And that we somehow kind of map these things out and list these things that have been brought up. So, what are the tensions inherent in this particular thing? What are the potential pitfalls? What are the good things about it? How does it work within the framework that the administration is putting out, or does it not? Those kinds of things, so that we're not just kind of talking in circles and sort of bringing up different things at different times. Not that we can't always loop back to things, but I just feel like there's so much we could easily get lost in all of the different ideas if we don't somehow track them and sort of check off like, okay, this one's not going to work, and here are the reasons it's not going to work. So let's prioritize and focus on these few that should be moved forward. And maybe you already have.
I think that's a great idea.
A way of doing that, but
And aligning the readings with sort of the list of possibilities, because I think one thing that's I feel very mindful of is the folks in this room might have ideas on what's going to work, and the administration might have ideas of what's going to work. And we might have thousands of community members watching us who have a very specific idea about what's going to work. And if we don't take testimony on that as well, we're not doing our due diligence. And so I think we need to give some airtime to, a lot of things. Yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting place to go, because there are going to be some significant differences in the literature and in Vermont too, because of the way it's structured. And one of the things that we always used to run up against is that Vermont districts, most of them, I don't think anyone has more than a single high school in their district. And many districts have only, or had only one school. When we start talking about how we fund districts, we also, if we have bigger districts, have to talk about how we fund schools. Because the challenge in other states is not actually, or sometimes it's equity across districts, but it's also equity within districts. And that's a conversation we've never had in Vermont, because we've never had a reason or opportunity to have in Vermont. And so we're gonna have to have some work there. But I offer that by way of saying that sometimes you also noticed in the Lincoln report, they left Vermont and Hawaii out because of the uniqueness of our systems. So the very, premises in some of those readings, we have to then reprocess them for the context of Vermont. And so we have to read these readings for what we can learn, but we also have to read them with extreme caution, because it isn't, and even we need to be very careful about statistics. I mean, they were saying that something like 35% of local spending is on education. And we don't do local spending here in Vermont, but is 35 the benchmark then for state total spending to be dedicated to education? If so, we might feel a little differently about where we are. So I just think there's just a lot. I just think we have to be incredibly thoughtful about walking from the literature to who we are and back, which isn't to discredit it, but it needs to be read through the lens of where we are.
And I think, I'm sure everyone has seen this, but it's, when folks are coming, it's really, really important we learn from folks outside Vermont. 100%. I don't think we do that enough. And it's really pretty wild, the learning curve when someone comes from outside Vermont to work with our education finance system. And like the amount of that they need to put into that. I just recently started spending a lot of time reading about Hawaii's tax system and finance system. And I really recommend it. It's really interesting in how the similarities to ours and the differences. And it's, also a state very dependent on tourism, with a lot of sort of hard to reach areas. And so even though it feels like 1,000 miles away, there are some interesting parallels to there. It actually is thousands of miles away. It doesn't just feel that way. Yeah.
I just got it written down, that's exactly how many miles.
Appreciate, sorry. Appreciate you saying a while back. Can't remember the word, but you were basically saying, given what the federal government, Trump may or may not do, the whole thing may be turned on its ear. And I appreciate that, and that's very much true. On a smaller version of the same thing, I have no idea what the Scott administration will do with what we propose, for example. And to be sarcastic, cynical at the beginning, just for the sake of it. We could do our work and the administration may say, we don't like it, go back and start over. And I would prefer to be optimistic and think that we can find some common ground or common threads and we can work forward. But the opposite may turn out to be true. And I really have no idea, and we won't know until we get there, and we'll have to, as we recognize here, do our due diligence and do a concrete, credible job at what we're doing and saying this is pretty good. And we'll have to see how the administration reacts to it.
I feel both very hopeful about the fact that education finance and education policy is rarely partisan. It tends to be geographic, for better or for worse. That's the reality, right? And that so far we've had a lot of great collaboration with the administration on this. And so I think we need to, it's all of our responsibilities to keep that line open. I don't think Vermonters are going to have any patience for us not doing that.
Yeah.
And I think the administration understands that as well.
Express more fear. And it's really, I'm optimistic that we all have some imperatives now we have to address and hopefully can do together. I'm mindful that our public education system, for better or for worse, is the only institution that touches every community in the state. It is our last strongest safety net. And risk is compounding. And so when there is risk at the federal level, risk at the local level, those are additive. And I do think that we may have to balance our hopes and dreams with the reality of the risk to which it is responsible to expose our communities. So this is not a stable time.
And speaking of which, my local superintendent is very anxious to understand what's going on in this committee room. So I call him on phone frequently. And, he has some surprisingly important things to share. I mean, I think of him as just being kind of a local, focused on the 3 schools in our school district. But maybe because of his tenure, or I don't know why, but he has a good view of what's going on in the state. So I mention that because I think all of you should not hesitate to reach out locally to your people.
Yeah, if folks have not done that yet, please set up a regular meeting with superintendents, school boards, teachers, staff. I think that's huge. And we're going to have sort of the Superintendents Association and the School Boards Association and the Teachers School Staff Education Association in regularly, as well as probably the Principals Association and the Business Managers Association. I have are particularly helpful to this committee. And we're going to have them in regularly, and then also have folks who are in the field doing that work. And so if you have anyone who's sort of working in your school system, please add them to a list with Sorsha so we can make sure they come in on particular issues. I want to, Rapulcum, you said something about sort of equity within districts. And I would say in my district, that's actually been quite a contentious issue because, when we essentially just consolidated from a supervisory union into a district, but didn't, the outline stayed basically the same. And the contentiousness was about fears that one of the elementary schools in one area was going to be sort of prioritized over the others. And I think that it still plays out, and it's still a really big conversation. And there's still a lot of legacy spending, regardless of the fact that it's one district with one budget. And I think it's an interesting part of the work, and I imagine it will get magnified if we move to larger districts.
Put that on steroids.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and it's a different context entirely, but it has some similarities, and I lived in Evanston, Illinois before I moved to Vermont 15 years ago. And that was always the fight within the Chicago public schools, was that it was one school district, one school board, one administration, and different schools were resourced extremely differently within that system to the detriment of a lot of neighborhoods and kids. And it's almost like a sort of an urban version of what we have in Vermont.
I mean, Burlington, maybe 20 years ago, 25 years ago, was going to be required to start busing kids from one neighborhood to another within Burlington because there were such inequities within the elementary schools there. And they've really done incredible work to change that, but it took a lot. Mark, you were going to jump in a while ago. I'm
Hey,
sorry.
Madam Chair, just, I'm a little reluctant. I mean, certainly reaching out to my school boards and
Mhm.
actually select boards too, but I want to maybe hear the information from the February 3rd
Mhm.
presentation. You know, I don't want to sit there with these folks because they're going to ask me a ton of questions. And I don't want to sit there and say, I don't know. I don't
Yeah,
know. I haven't a clue.
Mhm.
I mean, that's not going to be helpful.
Yeah.
I can still listen to them, but again, if they don't have an idea as to even, you know, how it's gonna transpire or what it's gonna be set up like or whatever, or the cost, base cost, on and on and on. Anyway, I don't wanna, I'm not ready yet to
Yeah.
engage in that sort of conversation.
I
And
would
I'll-
say we just in South Burlington had a forum with the community because we have one every month. Like no matter what's happening, we have one every month as the legislators in South Burlington. And we just sort of said, look, we don't have the details. Like, here's the framework. I mean, this is what I do know and this is what I don't know yet. And we're just waiting for more detail at this point. And I think it does help a little bit to just help people feel like they're in this room with us a little bit to understand where we are and where we're not. Because I think otherwise they just assume that we know a lot more than we do and we're not sharing it with them. And so we just try to be super transparent with the community about where we are.
Yeah, and I'm not to say that you should do what I do, but I'm just keeping lines of communication open and saying things like, what is exciting to you about sort of what you're hearing in the news? What do you feel nervous about that? Like, what are you hoping can happen in our district?
But again, the difference in my community is I have 8 towns.
Yeah.
Right.
So I can't take,
Yeah.
each night that they have a, school board meeting,
Yes.
maybe I can, have a group get together
Yeah.
at some point. But again, it's a little tough for me to do that.
And that's interesting, like, what must that be like for your superintendent to try to manage all of that, right? And like, what is that like? That's an interesting insight into what consolidation might change, right?
Superintendents.
Yes, yeah,
Oh,
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, just to kind of, one of my odd comments, we need to be conscious about what lens we're talking through. Because there's so many out there, there's some that are small schools versus large schools is really mostly what they focus on completely. Others it has to do with financial equity and various other sorts of things. And it's easy to have those conversations getting intermingled even while we are in the middle of it without even recognizing. So I try to be cognizant of who I'm talking to on what level. And I easily get diverted from where I'm trying to go into answering the constituents' concerns. And I'm just bringing this up as a thing, if I'm not paying attention to you around the table, it may be because I'm down some rabbit hole somewhere that I think is relevant, but may not be to the folks around the table. So I'm just mentioning that. So.
Me too. And, I think that a lot of the conversation we've had today is about the very real affordability issues that we are facing, the very real crisis in how we fund our schools. But I also just want to add, at least in my district, like the schools themselves are in crisis too. Like the teachers are not doing okay. The students are not doing okay. Families are struggling, and, we can't look at these proposals and look at these funding structures without acknowledging that, like, substance use disorder is an education funding problem. All of these things are so interconnected. And yes, we have to provide relief to the taxpayers. And I think all of you have heard me say a million times that I think the wrong people are paying too much for too little. But we also have to understand that the schools need the legislature to lead in this session too, because they cannot fix these issues by themselves. And it's bad. It's really bad. And I think that going to the school and doing a shadow day, if your school will allow it, is something that I would recommend to folks on this committee too, because like, once you go under the hood, there's a lot more problems. There are a lot more things that are broken than even we're aware of right now.
And I mean, I think a lot of the folks in this room represent districts that are like chronically underfunded because of, community members' very real fear around property taxes, right? And that's not fair to those kids.
Right.
And so like we talk about within district equity, I think there are conversations about like what Brigham means, right? And Brigham happened because there was huge inequities from district to district. We have huge inequities now from district to district.
Yes.
Teddy, I appreciate what you're saying about a school shadow day or whatever terminology you used. I think it's something that we can do individually or piece by piece or something like that. But I think in many cases, staff, school teachers in particular, just want to know that we're aware of their plight and we care. That's a very good start right there. And we can all speak conversantly to our schools, staff. And I'm a firm believer of do what you can where you are with what you got. I mean, you just start a conversation as you're suggesting. Goes a long way sometimes.
So I went to a community action committee meeting Monday night at my school district, and unfunded mandates was part of the discussion. They were talking about human services functions that are handled by the school and paid for by the school.
Mhm.
And they were also they even discussed statewide healthcare contract for
Mhm.
education. And if there might be savings if it went back to the districts individually.
Yeah. And that's something that came up in the commission this summer really regularly.
I just want to go back to what Teddy said, because this is actually one of the things that worries me the most about where we are right now. I wish when the commission had looked at the data, it had also looked at how Vermont schools spend on support services relative to instruction compared to neighboring states. Because what I've seen in that data is that we consistently spend more in Vermont schools on support services, including some of the social services that Teddy's talking about. The challenge is that if you're a disadvantaged community, you may have to spend a disproportionate amount of your funding on support services just to enable kids to feel safe. We have kids who get 3 meals a day out of the schools. They get all of their support services at schools. They get clothing at schools. And I could keep going. And
Philip Falls Elementary has a washer dryer there and does laundry.
we used to wash.
And they have to.
We used to wash kids' hair at school because they didn't have running water at home. And I don't think people understand the extent to which our schools are picking that up. And that is why some kids feel that they have a safe place where they're treated with dignity and respect. You can see this across districts. You can see that some districts have a lot more proportionally on social services than other districts. And if we tear that out, we are going to do active harm to young children. And when we talk about performance results, there's so much research now on stress and trauma and the impact on learning. To make this entirely about schools not teaching when we know a growing proportion of our students are experiencing severe trauma and, often secondary trauma associated with things like addiction. I feel like it's blaming the it's trying to provide the support. And we have to sort of rally around the fact that this is a shared problem of all of our communities. We're going to sink or swim together, and we have to figure out how to maintain those safety nets. And so my fear is moving carefully without thinking through the whys, we actually could do a tremendous amount of harm to the only Vermonters who can't vote.
I agree with you, and I'm really glad to hear you say that. I mean, I think I knew you knew that anyway, but I agree with you, absolutely. And backing up a little bit to healthcare, I hear a lot at home that teachers have such good healthcare, way better than mine. It scares me to think about changing that. So what if they have good healthcare? We should all have good healthcare. And so what we should do as we're walking through this, I know there's expense involved, but try to figure out how we can build everybody else up instead of pulling them down. I don't think that's the right thing to do. And so if there's a way to do that, you've been thinking about it, Teddy, obviously, probably more than I have, even through our age difference. If you can think of a way that we could do that, at least for Vermonters, maybe not the whole country, but, or at least for the children.
Mhm.
You know, people my age get Medicare. So things are a little easier, but, I won't go on and on about it, but I really do not want to pull the teachers down and seek equity that way.
Well, and I would say to Teddy's point about people in schools not being okay, teachers already feel like they're under attack.
Yes.
And I think partly our school, the way we fund schools has led to that frustration because we end up pitting the districts against the community, or that's how it ends up anyway, because we're pushing to the districts all the responsibility for trying to make all of this work with a lot of unfunded mandates that we're expecting them to uphold. And so they go out trying to do their best to alleviate poverty, to teach kids, to, pay teachers well and give them good health care. And that's expensive and it's a growing expense. And so we leave school boards and school districts out there to kind of fight that battle. And then it ends up in this ugly situation where you're pitting part of the community who doesn't have kids in the system. And I'm just trying to, live out my retired life, or I'm never going to have kids and I don't want to have to pay for other people's, because it leads to this fight. And I think that there's definitely a better way, but you're right. The morale in schools is already pretty tough from teachers because of all the budgets being voted down. I mean, we see this in South Burlington, which is considered, pay your teachers really well. They should be really happy, but they feel like the community doesn't support them. It had always been a community that really supported schools. And because of the increases in property taxes over the last few years, in the last 10 years, we've at least 3 times, maybe 4 times had to vote our budget 3 times to get it through. And the teachers just walk around feeling like everyone hates us. They don't like what we're doing. They think we get paid too much and they don't understand what we're managing, especially post-COVID with kids' behaviors and all the stuff that they're trying to hold up and hold together for all of us.
We have not passed a budget on the first time since I've lived in Barry. It's literally never happened. And it doesn't. It's this, it's the death spiral. It's this unhealthy dynamic where we're not all pulling together for the community. We're pulling apart. It just isn't working.
Brooke Kinfield, I think part of what you were saying about the unfunded mandates is those human services needs, those, social needs that they're not even, it's not that the state even mandates them, it's that they're sort of essential to do all the other work that's mandated by the federal government or the state government, right? Like for a kid to be successful, with a 504 plan, they might need all of these other social services wrapped around them, or for kids to be able to behave in school, or just like being humans together. It's impossible to not say you're hungry, I will feed you, and how that gets paid for, and the general funds, continued reduction in paying for that means that it all just sort of sits on the school. And I don't, pulling that apart, I think is in some way the work of the education committee. But it's it's something that we're going to need to keep in mind. So I'm going to go back to sort of the original functional conversation that we were having, and just say the idea of sort of really aligning the readings that we've been doing in the webinars with very specific policy ideas in a document, and having people sort of divide up those policy ideas to lead on is something that I'm going to make a little mini project of over the next few days. And we can see how that goes. I'm going to try to name really explicitly which bucket we're working within when we take testimony. And really ask people to do their best to sort of surfacing those tensions and assumptions and values when we are taking testimony, so we don't get too lost in the numbers and lose track of where our grand vision is. And I think with that, we're going to take a 5 to 10 minute break while we wait. Our security briefing is going to happen after this, which we will not be live for.